He was a hard worker, which is how every Mexican describes their dad. On Gonzalo's job sites, white men with clean nails called my father a solid guy, which he repeated with pride. We do not say retired in our house. Trabajadores never retire. Watching endless TV football matches, Gonzalo's body molded into his recliner and never left. My father's confident masculine hands disfigured into catatonic pincers for his remote controls. Dolores and Gonzalo were born in Mexico. They didn't share or explain what life there was like for them. When I asked, they said, everything is here. Who cares what came before? Did you forget already that you were born here? Act it. Growing up, Dolores asked me over and over, what are the rules to live in America? I didn't understand why, but I knew the answers well. Speak English in front of strangers. No Spanish anywhere outside the house. Walk far, but not too far, from gringos on a sidewalk until they have acknowledged you. Call any gringo you meet sir, even if they are young. Call any gringa you meet ma'am, especially if they are old. And never, ever cry in front of anyone, even if you think they are your friend. Do that, my mama said, and they'll let you become anything you want here.
Awesome. Thank you. I think
Thank
that's
you.
such a
Thank you.
good introduction, like looking back, having finished the whole book and like re-listening to that. It seems like such a accurate setup for the rest of the
Oh,
book.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to say I loved the book. I
Thank
thought it
you.
was
Thank you.
amazing. I thought the plot was really cool, super unique, and yeah, I devoured it super fast. It was a little scary, I'm not gonna lie, because it's a little
Sure, sure.
bit
I mean, well, it's October, it's Halloween, right?
a good
Yeah.
time for
So,
it. Yeah. Yeah, but I think it sets up my first question really well. My name is Iris. It's kind of futuristic, but it feels really eerily close to our current reality. How long did you spend working on Iris? And during your work, were there ever times that real world events happened or lined up with your fictional events and kind of freaked you out a little bit?
sure, sure. No, I appreciate that, and thank you for the kind words. So, for those of you who may not know, what the book is about, there's kind of a couple of things going on. It's about a woman who's recently gone through a divorce and has a 9-year-old child and has moved into a new home, is starting a new life. And the divorce is actually kind of like, drama free. And so she thinks, I have a chance to kind of like just get a fresh start and just really get a change, really. And this woman's name is Iris Prince. She's Mexican American, and I would say maybe ideologically conservative, just kind of like looking to do her own thing. And so she moves to this house and is kind of starting her morning routine, like putting where the coffee maker is and everything. And she's got this beautiful bay window. Part of the reason she bought this house is so she can look outside her front lawn and look at her front lawn and this kind of beautiful, just like perfect neighborhood with the cul-de-sac and everything. And so one morning she comes out to her kitchen. She's making herself some coffee. She turns around and sees right there where her beautiful front lawn used to be is a wall where there was no wall before. Dun, dun, dun. So, what happened? Why is this happening? What's going on here? And while this is happening, she lives in a state in America, not dissimilar to California, it's not named, where a new proposition has passed. And the proposition dictates that state services can only be supplied to people who get this new wristband. And it's kind of like this techie thing where it's like, oh, everything goes on the band. So, like your driver's license, if you want to pay like your trash can bill, if you want to like enroll your kids in school, everything's on the band. And the band is only available to people who can prove parental citizenship. So as you see, these two things kind of meld together as Iris Prince was initially born Inez. And Inez soon realizes, oh, I can't prove parental citizenship, even though I thought I could. And there's this wall that's growing outside of my front door. It's rising like every sort of few days. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the novel ostensibly is, I guess, sort of my take on like what it means to be just, I think, a person right now living in America who has these sort of unique set of circumstances, and how will this character respond? I think one of the things I talk about with my students all the time is like, you put your character in a situation and you just kind of ratchet up the tension and you see how they respond. So that's where that all that came from. Obviously, the wall, technology, etc. These are things that I think that have been part of our national conversation for quite some time. I got the initial idea for this sometime around 2015. And I remember telling my agent, she doesn't like me to tell this story, but it's okay. Where I was like, hey, I've got this idea. And she was like, okay, like I see it, I hear it. This was around 2016, early 2016. And she was like, but after the 2016 election and Hillary wins, this book's going to be kind of dated. So, like maybe you might want to think about doing something else. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to keep working on this. Let me just see. Let me just kind of feel how it like, plays out. And this book, honestly, it just took me a lot longer to write because as you mentioned, there was no way for me to kind of keep up with what was happening because this book in a certain way is kind of a satire, but like anything that like had a more explicitly satirical, there was a lot more stuff going on in this book, but I realized like anything that like I used as satire quickly became outdated and I couldn't keep up. So a lot of it just kind of got stripped back just to like the wall and the bands because I felt those were the most interesting ideas. And so right around like again, like 2021, when I was like kind of in the home stretch in the book and again, talked to my agent and she was like, yeah, okay, so the book will come out, but again, it's like all that stuff's in the rear view mirror and like, like certain people who are running for office. I'm not going to name any names, but like certain people who are running for office, it's like it's just going to be kind of a relic of a certain time. So, are you sure you want to like, kind of keep with it? And I was like, you know what? Let me just keep writing this. And it's one of those weird things where, the book has come out and it's almost it's not even like satire because it's like,
Yeah.
well, it's kind of here. So that for me is kind of like the point of the book. And I guess maybe for those of you who are out there wondering, well, why would I want to buy a book if like this is going on like in the New York Times every day? Because for me, the exciting part is like what fiction can reveal to us about ourselves.
Mm.
So it's not just about the times that we're living in, but like how we respond to those times. And I think that's to me what's interesting and cool about the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads super well into my next question about characters. And I think
Mm.
a huge component of this, there's a big plot component here, but a large part of this novel is also driven by the characters themselves and hugely by Iris and the different decisions she makes and the
Mm.
motivations behind those decisions that she makes. So, in terms of Iris, I kind of loved to hate her a
Oh,
little bit,
please. Yeah, no, please, please.
She's a little bit unlikable. I'm
She's
not
a
sure
lot.
that,
She's a lot to deal
yeah,
with. She's a lot to deal with. I
yeah.
hear you. I hear you on
I
that.
don't think we would have been friends, probably, but I enjoyed reading her story for sure. Um, and, as an author, it can be kind of, I think, intimidating to write an unlikable narrator. A
Mhm.
lot of times people will just drop a book if they hate the narrator.
Yeah, sure.
So, was it
Sure.
difficult writing Iris in that way? Was it kind of hard to sort of put yourself into her mindset of someone who has these pretty deep, prejudices towards kind of herself and her
Yeah.
family?
Yeah. So again, for those who are listening and joining in, it's that my character, I think, kind of sees herself as somebody who's just brutally frank, very honest. She's a Mexican American, but she's kind of like she's a tell it like it is person, and that like she has these very like strong held beliefs and convictions, and like people who come here, they should work for a living and not get government handouts and all these kinds of things, right? So I know it sounds crazy. I'm sure you having read the book, when I started getting this feedback, yeah, I really don't like this character. I was like, really? Because I was like, I don't know. I kind of like I like her in part because I feel like so much of her character is manifested by her response to traumatic situations.
Mhm.
And there's a couple of traumatic things that have happened to this character. Not even talking about the divorce, but if you read in the book, there's a section where she talks about how when she was young, she befriended, or should I say, a young girl befriended her named Brenda, and they became fast friends. And unfortunately, there was an incident at a McDonald's, which was actually inspired by an event that happened in San Ysidro in the mid 80s, where somebody walked into a McDonald's with a machine gun and murdered a number of people. And her friend Brenda is murdered, in this event. And again, I think in real life there are so many things that can contribute to a character closing up, or a person closing up, or contribute to their trauma. But I think in fiction, you kind of need that one like kind of like crystallized moment. And that moment comes about a third in the way in the book. And my hope again was like, hey, like this character that is kind of closed up and very tightly wound and says all these kind of like controversial, maybe like just aggressive things. Well, here's the moment. Here's the moment where she realized, oh, in order to survive in America, I need to blend in. And this is how I blend in. This is how I choose to blend in, by adopting these philosophies, by being pro-American and super American. And like in that way, nobody can question who I am. Nobody can question my place in this country. And I think that happens to a lot of people. I think that happens to a lot of like, persons of color. I think it happens to just a lot of people here who live in this country, who basically just want to kind of like live their lives and survive and just, not really be bothered by what's going on. And what's happening with the wall and the bands is it's basically this is kind of life coming to her doorstep saying, you can't ignore that anymore. You kind of
Mhm.
have to take a side. So I think for Iris, for me, the interesting part is like, what will it take? How far will she go out denying her identity, denying her Mexican Americanness, denying, all these things that are happening around? And as you see in the novel, she'll go out, she's got pretty far. She gets pushed pretty far, but even she has a breaking point. So
Mhm.
for me, that's where I feel like, you know, the draw was, can I create a character that maybe is not likable, but also I feel pretty realistic and a response to the times that we're living in right now, because it's not really likable times right now. So I'm doing a great job selling this book, aren't I? I'm just really just like, wow, I really want to go out and pick this up. It's a perfect stocking stuffer for Christmas. So
It is. I think so. No, but yeah, I loved hating Iris, like I said, but
thank you.
I
Thank you.
think, I think yeah, you see so much that goes into why she is the way that she is. And I don't think, that means we excuse her behavior, but it means we
You can
understand it and
understand
we
it. Yeah,
can
exactly.
see
Exactly.
why she is the way that she
Yeah.
is. Um, Speaking of characters, it seems like, most of the characters in this novel are women, especially
Hmm.
sort of your leading cast. We have Mom, we have
Yeah.
Iris, we have
Yeah.
Mel,
Yeah.
Serena.
Yeah.
Um, is there maybe a reason you gravitated towards writing women for this one? And I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, but we know that towards the end, it's the four of them
Yeah.
together, the family of women, all
Yeah.
alone. Did you know that it was always going to be the women in the end?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you asking that. Thank you. So, a little bit about my biography, which I've also written about in a book you can buy, called Take This Man. So I was raised in a house of women. My biological father, took off when I was 3, and my mother essentially decided to reinvent me as an American Indian, hence the name Skyhorse, and I didn't know that until I was 12 or 13. And then my mother basically encouraged me to keep up the lie because she had reinvented herself as an American Indian too. So I was raised by kind of this rotating cast of like stepfather characters who were kind of drift in and out every 3 years. But my primary caregivers were my mother and my grandmother. So I feel like I've been drawn to women characters pretty much, since my first book, The Madonnas of Echo Park. Half the characters, it's like 9 chapters, and half the chapters are narrated by women, because I feel like that's just how I grew up. I grew up listening to women's voices. I grew up listening to my mother's and grandmother's concerns. my grandmother was very much, I used to call her like the mayor of Echo Park, California, which is where I grew up, because she knew everybody and everybody talked to her. And, she would get this bit of gossip here and this, little bed of gossip over there. And she would like trade information and such. So when it came time to write my own fiction, to me, the women characters were just so much more interesting to follow because I felt like their voices were just so much more attuned to my interest and my preoccupations. And I guess that's where that comes from. Um, I don't know if that really answers it, but like, yeah, it seems a lot more natural to me. Because again, also, the guys that, I grew up with, the stepdads, they were kind of louses. So like, it's not really that interesting to write about a louse. It's like the louse is just kind of like there to like muck things up. Whereas like all the sort of like demands of like, how are we gonna like live? How are we gonna like pay for groceries? How are we gonna just do these day-to-day things? You know, the women in my household were in charge of everything. So that to me has always been that's where the sort of richness of fiction starts for me in those voices.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of the same. I was raised by a single mom and a grandma and a plethora of like aunties that were primarily single moms as well. So everything, all the voices in my head are women, and
Yeah,
my
yeah.
worldview is shaped by women. And
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I think that, but I think that makes a difference. And, again, it was certainly, it was never my intention to, kind of create an unlikable female character in a lead, but more specifically, and I think you see this as you go through the novel, like there is a redemption path
Mhm,
for Iris, in part because she has a 9-year-old daughter. And so I think at a certain point, you know, her sort of goal to basically protect her daughter at all cost so that her daughter doesn't have the same kind of experiences. And if you read the book, you'll see, Iris had a lot of very like, microaggressions, macroaggressions, things that like kind of shaped her worldview. And I think that she is so insistent on that path not being her daughter's path and holds on to it so tightly, it's like almost everything else is excluded. And so I think that having that path with, sort of Iris and her daughter, and then getting these like external voices from her sister, from her mother
mhm,
saying, hey, like there are other paths available, there are other options available to you. That to me, that richness of community amongst the four of them, because in a certain way, they all understand each other. They all
mhm.
understand, like, their sort of their place in this ecosystem in their community. That's really what I wanted to capture too, like that close-knit family bond. That, it's certainly it's important to me. So,
Yeah, definitely. I could see it for sure. And I think even Iris, your main character, being an unlikable woman, all of the characters in this novel have complexities and things that make them unlikable.
oh yeah, sure,
Even
thank you.
Dolores, she made mistakes in the beginning.
Yeah,
She was kind
yeah,
of the first catalyst for
yeah,
Iris wanting to start passing.
yeah,
Serena is an activist, but
yeah,
Iris talks about her not really actually being a boots on the ground kind of person, and she kind of
yeah.
is all talk and that's it. And then Alex, her ex-husband, he's a whole nother thing.
He's a whole other
So
thing, yeah. Perfect people trying their best to aspire to be
exactly.
better versions of themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, they're humans. They're
Yes. Yeah.
superhumans. And I think it was so cool to see these like really rich, dynamic characters with so much depth. Even the side characters having these motivations that you got to see throughout the novel was really awesome.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you. They
yeah,
appreciate that.
and talking about side characters, I want to talk about Brenda because I think
Sure.
she's what probably a lot of us one of our favorite side characters.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so the mass shooting that takes place, we've kind of
Yeah.
already talked about, is
Hmm.
sort of one of the main catalysts for Iris to sort of really full-fledged go, I'm gonna pass and I'm gonna
Yeah.
be, as close to whiteness as I can get and as
Yep.
American as I can get. Um, you know, so Brenda's spirit kind of appearing to Iris seemed sort of a representation of who she really was and her true self. And
Yeah.
at the same time, kind of a representation and manifestation of her fear and her, this deep-seated fear, which is the true motivation behind all of this is fear and fear of being othered, fear of being hurt by that otherness. So were you kind of always intending for Brenda to manifest as and show up throughout the book, or were you kind of intending to have her be in that scene and then that was it? Or was that your plan? How did that come about?
See, this is why I love these conversations because I literally had no idea what the heck Brenda was doing in this book until you just described, like 10 seconds ago. Like, yeah, that is what she was doing. It's manifesting fear. This is her like kind of it's like an alternate timeline, right? Like what would have
Hmm.
happened? Like what Inez could have looked like had she been like thrust into this maybe older, more protective sister role, or maybe she would have made the same mistakes as Dolores, right? Like who knows, right? But
Hmm.
when I was putting these things together, it was kind of like, you talk to your editor, you talk to your agent, and like you can't like I had an idea they all belong, but like they couldn't see the big picture, like I'm still not convinced that they have seen the big picture now that the book is finished. But it was like, dude, there's a wall, and maybe it's there and maybe it's not, and there's this stuff going on with the bands, and what's that about? And then there's a ghost girl. What, it's too much. It's too much. But I was like, no, trust me, like they all kind of fit together. And I think again, like, thinking about like a community of women that like, again, Brenda is an innocent, is a young girl who, essentially Inez is giving her like American lessons. Like you got to go to
Hmm.
McDonald's and you got to learn to speak English and you got to get a job and you got to do all these things to be responsible, right? And that lesson, was like truncated. It was like snuffed out. And
Hmm.
so I think that sort of that manifestation of Brenda throughout the novel, it could be her guilt, it could be her conscience, it could be like again, this sort of voice, that's just reminding you, like, wherever you go, there you are. And I
Hmm.
think that, again, sure, the idea of like a wall that rises out of nowhere, I'm not being subtle about this, like it's pretty explicit, but the fact that it's right outside Iris's new front door. And
Hmm.
to me, I think that's where Brenda also kind of came to play because Brenda was just another pressure point, another sort of reminder that like, it doesn't matter where you turn, these things are going to follow you, your history, your culture, you know, your formative events, your childhood trauma. You can tell people like, oh yeah, like, I wasn't bothered by that. And that happened to me many years ago, but sooner or later, if you haven't dealt with it, if you haven't acknowledged it, it's going to
Hmm.
come, it will find you. It will find you. And I think that to me again was um a really interesting sort of template for a character who, as you said, is unlikable. And then as you start to unpack this, it's like, oh, yeah, I kind of get it. Maybe I wouldn't want to like, have dinner with her, but I understand. And
Hmm.
maybe also there's a part of me that sees when I'm short-tempered, when I say things that are probably provocative or, do things that are, short-sighted or what have you, when I'm not the best version of myself. Oh, yeah, that's me too. I'm on the page too. I
Hmm.
understand. I would like not to do that. I would like not to be that person, but I understand.
Yeah, definitely. I think most people are good and redeemable, and we're the victims of our circumstances a lot of the times, just like
Yeah, yeah,
Iris.
yeah. I think that's true. And I think that, again, Iris has to go through this journey. She has to go through this landscape that essentially she has herself bought into and has, I guess, um has come to a certain point where she believes like, as long as I just like keep my head down, stay quiet and do what I'm told, this won't impact me. Just follow the rules. Iris is very much like, well,
Hmm.
none of these issues would happen to people if you just follow the rules. And so the novel is like, well, we're going to change the rules and we're just going to see how far, you kind of stretch this ideology until it gets
Hmm.
to its breaking point.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of talking about like the wall and the bands,
Mm,
it sort of
hmm
reminds me of, our current immigration sort of steps and the way it's so hard. You have green cards, you have residency cards, and
Hmm.
you have work
Hmm.
permits, you've got
Hmm.
visas,
Hmm.
all of that stuff. That having this band around your wrist doesn't really seem all that far-fetched.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So without revealing too much,
Yeah.
Iris makes a choice that puts her daughter at risk and lands her daughter in a detention
Yeah.
center.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it seemed to be a reminder to Iris that her daughter is not considered white, is not considered American. No matter how hard she's tried, and even though her daughter has this band and her daughter gets these privileges, at the end of the day, her daughter's parents are both Mexicans,
Yeah.
Mexican Americans.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that was like another pressure point for Iris and a reminder of who she, truly is and who she is deep inside. But was that child detention like an intentional planned plot point, or was it something that you added after current events kind of unfolded the way they did?
So again, like, this kind of came in pieces. And the detention center, um, the actual site of it was like a former like kind of superstore, almost kind of like a Walmart type of store. It's called like One Mart, but it's a place where you can kind of get everything, right? And so to me, I'd always had this idea of like, oh, okay, like the novel's going to kind of start here and it's going to kind of end here, and it has to end in a place that used to be like a symbol of commerce, like a
Hmm.
big sort of like it's literally where you get it all. To me, it just felt perfect. And then as I was writing the book and the stories came out, like what was going on at the border, the detention centers, and all this other stuff, it really wasn't that much of a leap at all. So it was kind of like I was doing my own thing and then just seeing this kind of play out in real time, and kind of going back to the book. It's like, okay, like, well, I think like whenever that happens to a writer, the instinct is like, oh, this is too much like real life. I'm going to pull back. Like I got to change the book now. But like I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to like
Hmm.
change any of it. Going back to like Brenda being shot, that was one of the first things I wrote because that was based on like San Ysidro, for instance, right back
Hmm.
in the '80s. And then when I was writing the book, the massacre in El Paso happened, the Walmart, and the
Right.
guy who like went. And again, there's been so many massacres, so many shootings, but that guy went in specifically. He wrote a manifesto. He went in specifically to look for Mexican Americans.
Hmm.
And, so again, it was this weird sort of like kind of echo. And I think the idea for me is like, if you are writing in this beat, if you're covering this territory, if you're writing about like racism, bigotry, identity, or whatever, it's like there's nothing really kind of new under the sun. It's kind of all
Hmm.
been done, right? So I think for me, it was like, I'm just going to keep doing this, and whatever will happen will happen. But as far as kind of taking from real life, it was like, no, like the kind of the broad strokes were already kind of there.
Hmm.
With again, the whole impetus for this, back in like 2015, 2016, I've told this story a couple of times, but the idea of the wall was always omnipresent. The book was actually going to be called Wall at one point. It was just that was it. And my editor's like, Brando, come on, do you want to sell some books or not, man? Like nobody's going to go into a bookstore and buy a book called Wall, right? Which is okay, it's a fair point, right? But like that was always there, and I was drawn to that word because like at a certain point in 2015, 2016, the word wall ceased to be, for me at least, it ceased to be this kind of like benign noun, and it became an insult. It had like this
Mm.
percussive sound to it, and then like attached with a couple of other words, it became an attack. So I was really fascinated by the idea of like this thing that could just be like just a benign kind of thing, all of a sudden attach a couple words to it, and it becomes a chant. And what happens when that like transformation occurs. So I knew I had the wall, and I knew I had this kind of amorphous ending, like there's going to be a detention thing or whatever. But yeah, I feel like these kinds of things were always roughly part of the plan. And these things, when you try to write a book, it's like, this one took 6 years. And I think maybe a part of that was that sense of like every time something happened in, real time, there was that pause of like, is this too close? Am I mirroring things? Will this be out of date? But I was like, no, like this is kind of what I want to say as an artist and what I want to say as a writer right now. So I just kind of like put it put my head down and just kept going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting because as you were talking about how, these things kind of repeat and nothing is really new.
Mm,
Um,
mhm.
I don't want to ever compare tragedies or horrible things
Yeah,
or anything,
sure.
but it did remind me of, when the United States was imprisoning Japanese people and
Yep,
families and children.
yep,
Um,
for sure.
and so, yeah,
For
it
sure.
seems at first you're like, oh, that seems crazy. And then you're like, wait a second, it is not
Yeah, it's
crazy at
yeah.
all.
Anyone who knows LA history, yeah, Santa Anita, like the racetracks, yeah. And so these echoes, I think, happen, when we have certain time periods where uh, our society feels very fragile and very vulnerable. I'm not even talking about democracy, just I feel like our society feels
Hmm.
very fragile and very vulnerable, and it's fear.
Fear, yeah, they're
And when
afraid.
fear kind of
Mhm.
like is driving the bus, bad things happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can see like the majority of Iris's decisions are made based out of fear, and
Yeah,
especially,
exactly. And I think to that point, right? Like, you want to take like a character, an unlikable character in fiction. And how do you make a character unlikable? All right. Well, that's the
Mhm.
easiest thing in the world for me. The hardest part is making sure that they're not so unlikable. You just throw the book across the room like this person's a jerk. But like, what happens when you run a life dictated by fear? And I think it's an important for me, it's like an important reminder because, I think of like just sort of the times in my life where like the times when I've been the most afraid, the times where I've been like the most like petrified of things. It's like you can do things that are harmful to yourselves and harmful to others. And I feel like again the book hopefully is kind of a reminder is that like you know redemption is possible, but there has to be like an active choice. And as you said earlier, when Iris makes that choice and her daughter ends up going to the detention center, I think for her that's like the moment of no return. That's the moment
Hmm.
where it's like she kind of has to look her fear right in the mirror and are like, this is who you are now.
Hmm.
And so, again, it might be too little too late, but to me, it does feel ultimately hopeful. I do feel that there is hope for Iris. And again, it's to me, the ending, not to spoil it, but like, I think it is a hopeful ending. And I feel like as far as like a happy ending as I could potentially write for this timeline, because,
Hmm.
again, this book is mirroring what's happening right now. And I want us to have a happy ending for this timeline in 2024. I don't know, I would love it if like somebody looked at my book and said, this is so ridiculous and this will never happen. And then 5 to 10 years from now, like, wasn't it crazy? We thought this kind of stuff was going to happen and we'll just like put it on the trash heap. Awesome. Great. I hope.
Yeah,
I
you're like,
hope.
I would really like to be wrong.
Yeah, I
That would
would
be great.
really, really like for this not to be like, oh wow, I clearly undershot what I thought was going to happen. I should have like, so I think again, right? Like I hope that when you write a novel, and you as a writer, I'm sure you understand this too, is that like you want to entertain and you want to give people a great story, but I think also there's a sense of like, hey, this is where my thinking is, and where's your thinking? How are you feeling about all of this? Maybe this will give you some like pause for reflection as well, and maybe get you to look at things that's going on in your life and, think about things in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I love books that make you think, and Iris, I don't want to say she reminded me of myself, but there were moments, I think we all have growing pains and have to
Sure,
learn in,
sure.
and things like that. And she certainly reminded me of people that I know, that's for sure. Um, unfortunately.
Okay, okay. So in that sense, yeah, very accurate. Like Brando wasn't making things up here. It's like, oh, I know an iris or two. Yeah.
I
Okay.
sure do. I sure do.
Fair enough. Fair
So
enough.
kind of my last question, I think,
Yeah,
was a
sure.
really good finisher, and then maybe we'll have a few Q&As.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
Um,
that sounds great.
yeah, but so I saw this whole novel kind of as an overall metaphor for the American dream.
Mm,
Um, the goalposts are constantly moving. The gatekeepers are continually changing who
mm,
can and cannot align as one of
mm,
them. And those laws that those gatekeepers are enforcing or writing or whatever are kind of growing in oppression and control.
mm.
So is there another book in this future, do you think? Is there a sequel? Is there, a future for Mel and Enos?
Uh, That's a good question. I don't feel I've been asked that. Thank you. Yeah, you caught me off guard there. Usually I'm so busy. Like, no, she's worth reading 300 pages. Just stick with it, I promise you. She gets redeemed in the end, I promise you. I don't know, actually. I feel like this every one of the books that I've written, the Madonnas of the Echo Park, my memoir, this is basically set in a state of California. I was born in California, I was raised in California, and for me, it's like it's always going to be my home. Like, however, wherever I'm in Indiana or anywhere, like it's always going to be my home. So I feel like every book that I write kind of is reconciling sort of my relationship with my childhood and California and my Mexican American identity. And I think again, maybe this book is kind of like done everything I feel I can do with this aspect of my relationship to my identity. So I don't know. I feel like if something happens that kind of like I feel like there's another interesting story for these characters. Yeah, I would love to revisit them, and yeah, maybe there's another book where um, Iris is like a goody two shoes and like goes out of her way and is just like, just hey, I'm the nicest person in the world. I don't know. I have a feeling that any book that would move forward again would center on Mel being older and I
Hmm.
think again, like the relationship between Mel and Iris, Mel as probably a teenager and coming to grips with her own identity and maybe even like learning about some of the things that have happened here. Because again, like in this timeline, it's almost like maybe they'll be in exile, maybe they'll be somewhere else. I don't
Hmm.
know, but I think if I were to approach these characters again, I got to give them a much happier sort of timeline. Maybe like things have kind of worked out and they're dealing with like normal things, like, Mel wants to borrow the car or wants to go to prom or stuff like that. Just a more reasonable timeline. So if I do come back to them, I want to give them an easier time out for sure.
Absolutely. I have to say, I really liked the way that you ended it. I'm a fan personally of like ambiguous, sort of
Mm.
open endings. I know that a lot of people do not like that kind of stuff. They like it, tied up with a
Just
bow and
tell me what happened.
explained. Yeah, yeah, but I'm a fan. I like it. I think it's a good way to leave it open to interpretation and sort of the reader's own wonderment and ideas of what could be or might be, or maybe they never even made it that far. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like the idea of wonderment. I do, and I do feel that readers really can figure things out, and I really kind of like just to give them maybe just the sort of the opportunity. I like using that word a lot. The opportunity to figure out for themselves because whatever their sort of like definitive idea about these characters, it's much better than anything than I could actually devise for them, something that's like so specific and concrete. So for me, it's like
Hmm.
here's this situation, here's this the world that I've sketched out. You create your own ending. You decide what happens to these characters, and you know, maybe if you have a relative that veers a little too much like Iris, maybe you give them this book and you say, hey, maybe you might want to check that out. Though there's always a chance of that backfiring because,
I
they
was
could be
gonna
like, hey, this
say.
person's great. See, I told you. So I don't know, maybe don't do that. But yeah, I always like to give the reader the sort of the space and the opportunity to kind of put their own spin and kind of like leave the ending up to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Okay, so we have a question and it's about the wall.
Sure.
Why did you decide to make the wall appear out of nowhere opposed to it being slowly built?
Yeah. Yeah. That one kind of like went back and forth because and it got to the point where I was researching walls and then I was talking to people who build walls and like it was getting really into the weeds. So I think I just kind of like made a decision. And I think that, the idea of like just something that was so visually stark and just kind of like all of a sudden there, that kind of felt right to me. Because like I said, like going back to like, you know, 20, like if you were to go back to like 2015 and you were just to ask a random person on the street, like, hey, what does the word wall mean to you? Okay, whatever, right? And do that literally a year later,
Yeah.
you would get a vastly different response. So I feel to me,
Hmm.
this idea, the concept of the wall, happened very quickly. And it kind of took over our national discourse, not to kind of like dive us back into 2016, but I think we can all kind of remember because it's still kind of going on right now. But it just became this thing that was just sort of there and omnipresent. Like you all of a sudden it was there and you couldn't get away from it.
Mhm.
So to me, that felt like, again, representative of like what I wanted to have Iris's experience to be like. And I felt like it had to be something that was so stunning and so shocking to kind of like get her out of the like, oh, okay, what's this? What's happening? Like I have my perfect brand new home, I have my brand new setup. This what's ruining this? Like this is ruining like my perfect picture. So I felt like it had to be something that was just very direct and very blunt so that she could at least like if not immediately dealing with it, kind of figure out, oh, okay, my attention is now here and now I've got to like figure this out or I have to start figuring this out. So that's where that
Mhm.
came from.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the wall too. It seems like it's kind of another aspect of just forcing her to confront
Yeah.
her reality, the choices she's made, her own fears, all of that. It's just another one of those, straws adding to her back.
Well, yeah, and right. And as you said, right, essentially the wall is a mirror, right? And
Mhm.
again, like not to make the heavy-handed metaphor even more heavy-handed, right? But the wall is basically it's everything that like she has been running from. So in the end, if it gets her to go through this journey and come out the other side, then ultimately, well, then it's probably a good thing. If there is a silver lining in this, that's like, okay, now we can have the conversation. Now that this thing is so blunt and so out there and so out in the open, and there's nowhere to run from it, now what are you going to do?
Mhm.
So
Absolutely. And then just a little craft question because it got
yeah,
me
sure.
thinking.
Yeah, sure.
Um, do you consider kind of the wall and things like that, would you call that magical realism or would you
Mm,
consider it sci-fi, technology, spec fic? What do you
yeah,
say personally?
Yeah, I feel like magical realism is like because I know some writers are like they get very tough. Oh, that's there's nothing magic about it, right? I think for me, what I really wanted to avoid was like turning this into like a Twilight Zone episode. You know what I mean? Where
Hmm.
there's like a
Yeah.
character who you know, this character is an alcoholic and their punishment is they're gonna be a bartender. And you know what I mean? Like there's some sort of like kind of very like easy parable or very, like kind of easy moral that's attached to it. So I don't know if magical realism is the right phrase for it, but like dystopic satire, I don't really know either. Like I feel like it's kind of got like a lot of different elements. I think if there's anything that it kind of veers closest to is maybe horror. And there is that sense of like, like if I could see the A24 trailer for this. You know what I mean? That
Yes.
like don't, like and then like I'm telling you, the wall wasn't there yesterday, like it would be like that. So because I'm a big fan of horror films, and I do feel that like there's a lot of interesting work in horror right now where you have characters like The Substance, for instance, which I heard stars
Mm.
Demi Moore and like is really fantastic. It's about body horror, but it's also about women in the Hollywood industry
Mhm.
and ageism and all these other things. So I feel that like in genre, like genre work like horror, for instance, you can kind of address these larger societal issues, but at the same time still have this like kind of like undercurrent of like, oh, what's going to happen to this person? Like, they're clearly in legitimate danger, and I'm focused on that, but then there's also some commentary attached to it as well. So maybe horror, but I don't know. Yeah, like I just kind of I wrote it and that was like it was kind of like I said, it's basically where my headspace has been for like the past 6 years. And you know, I would again, I'm not exaggerating, like I would love for like all of the topics that are addressed in this race, identity, class, gender, you name it. Um, I would love for this to be a relic. I would love for this to be
Outdated.
totally out of date a year from now. I would
Yeah,
really like that.
yeah, definitely. I think calling it a horror is a fair assumption
Yeah,
for
sure,
sure.
sure.
It definitely, I could see like it's similar to like Jordan Peele style horrors there too, where it's not always about the blood and the guts and the scare and the jump. It's about fear and like the
Yeah,
unknown or
the unknown and what's driving that. What is essentially what's coming for our characters, and usually what's coming for our
hmm.
characters. The worst thing is usually it's well, it's what's up there.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then we had a little question in the chat.
Mhm.
Um, are there any books that inspire you? It was asked to both of us. I don't have an answer right now, so maybe you can go first.
Sure. Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, I would love to hear what your inspirations are. It's always kind of like what I'm reading at the moment. So
Yeah.
I'm reading The Immortal King Rao by Valhini Vara, which is wonderful and fantastic. She has a new collection of short stories called This Is Salvaged, which is great, excellent.
Mm.
Hernan Diaz's Trust, which is really outstanding. Exit West by Moshe Hamid, I think was kind of a big inspiration with this book. And again, if anyone here hasn't read it, it's about immigration. It's about well, it's about basically two characters who are fleeing a city that's basically under like a civil war, and somebody tells them, "Oh, hey, there's a magic portal that can take you to another part of the world." So they go in this portal and like they kind of like hop to different countries. So again, you know, definitely like an inspiration in terms of like putting this book together. Moshe Hamid, I think, is just a fantastic writer. So yeah, Moshe Hamid, Vokini Vara, Hernan Diaz. Um, that's basically who I've been reading recently. How about you?
Yeah, it's usually people I read, I think too. Like I read a lot for inspiration or like if I'm stuck and I don't know where to go, I take a reading break and I'll devour like 5 or 6 books in the genre so I can
Oh yeah,
try to
for
get an
sure.
idea of where to go. But I've really been enjoying Gabino Iglesias lately.
Oh, okay.
I haven't read his new one yet, but The Devil Takes Me Home was one of my like all-time favorite books. It was so good, and it dealt a lot with kind of fear being one of those primary motivators for the main character. And so, yeah, I really liked his work, and I have Glass and Bone and Rain on hold at the library, so I'm just waiting for it so I can read that
Okay.
one.
Yes, can we please shout out the importance of libraries as our time rapidly comes to a close here.
Yeah.
Public libraries are awesome. They are an essential resource, and they make events like this possible.
Yes, I'm a huge library person. I use it every day.
I was coming on to say, what are some like some last closing thoughts from you? But I do really appreciate that shout out to libraries. Our library, we get to do things like this, and we get to host incredible people like you both. We get to have these discussions, and we get to record them and share them with our patrons here, but also online. But yeah, why don't thank you, and why don't you give us a few 30 seconds each if you want on closing. And again, appreciated and incredible conversation.
Danny, would you like to go first
Sure, I'll
or-
go first. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, the SF Library, and Brando for talking with me. It was really awesome. I'm so glad that I read this book and I got to meet you and everything. And yeah, I had a great time. And I'm always happy to do events for the library if you need people in the future.
So that's wonderful. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Alejandro. Thanks again to everyone who read this book, everyone who joined us here. Thanks again to the San Francisco Public Library. And I guess my final thought is support public libraries and support independent booksellers. So if you are so moved to buy my book or Danny's book, there are wonderful independent booksellers in your town or your community or online where you can get them, or you can go check them out from your local library. And if you haven't also donated to your local library, now would be a great time to add that to your Christmas to-do list. And no, I was not paid for that plug, I might add. So that's my life. That's my thing in general. Libraries and bookstores, important resources, both of them.
Libraries and bookstores go hand in hand. Here in San Francisco,
Absolutely.
we're lucky to have a number of nice independent bookstores that we all can support. Thank you both for coming to us from the East Coast and the Rust Belt is what I would call it, I guess. Okay, this is not rehearsed, obviously.
Yeah, there's more corn out here than rust, but sure, that's fine.
The Corn Belt. Thank you. We appreciate it. I'm getting kicked out of my building here. I appreciate you both. Thank you for the book. I'll tell our listeners here as well. We've had a lot of anecdotal stories from people who are checking out your book, who are telling us how much they like it. Thank you both. Have a good night, and thank all of you.
Thank you.